Let's build a Simio Simulation model for a healthcare clinic. The healthcare clinic will have the following stations, or offices. One for registration, another for triage, another for treatment, another one for lab, another one for x-rays, another one for MRI, another one for EKG, and finally, one for accounting. We will have 5 different patient types. One will be walk-in patients, another one will be for lab only, the third will be for x-rays, the fourth will be for MRI, the fifth will be for EKG. In this video, I'm going to show how to build a model with different patient routing sequences. The sequences are given in this table. For example, for walk-in patients, they will visit registration, then triage, then treatment. After that, they'll visit accounting, and then they'll exit the system. Patients that only require labs will go to the labs, then do the accounting, and exit the system. Whereas for x-rays, MRI, and EKG, they'll need to register first, then have the specialty service, then have accounting, and then exit the system. For this system, we'll have the following inter-arrival distributions. For the time between arrivals for walk-in patients, we'll use an exponential distribution with a mean of 6 minutes. For lab-only patients, we'll have an exponential distribution with a mean of 3 minutes. For x-ray patients, we'll have an exponential distribution with a mean of 12 minutes. For MRI patients, we'll have an exponential distribution with a mean of 10 minutes. Finally, for EKG patients, we'll have an exponential distribution with a mean of 30 minutes for the time between arrivals. For the service distributions, for each of the stations or offices, we'll have a different service time. We're going to use all triangular distributions using the random.triangular function in Simio with the following parameters in minutes. For registration, we'll have 1, 2, 3. For triage, 3, 5, 7 minutes. For x-rays, of 8, 10, and 12 minutes. For MRI, we'll have 14, 18, 22 minutes. And for treatment, we'll have 7, 10.5, 14 minutes. For labs, we'll have 6, 10, 14 minutes. For EKG, we'll have 20, 25, and 30 minutes. Finally, for accounting, we'll have 2, 5, 8 minutes. The other thing we're going to need to set for this system is a different number of servers depending on the station or the office. The initial capacity for registration, triage, and x-rays will be set to 1, so that we'll have 1 server at those particular stations or offices. For MRI and treatment, we'll have 2 servers, so we'll set the initial capacity to 2 for those. For lab and accounting, we will set those to 4 because we'll have 4 servers. Also, EKG we'll set to 1 because it'll just be 1 server, so we'll have 1 initial capacity for EKG. Let's build the model in Simio. We'll have 5 sources, and then we'll have 1 entity type for each source. Let's change the names for each entity type. The first one will be for walk-in patients. The second one will be for lab patients. The third one will be for x-ray patients. The fourth one will be for MRI patients. And the fifth one will be for EKG patients. Next, let's change the color on these entity types so that they're different. We'll keep the walk-in patients as green. For lab patients, let's set symbols and change the color to red. We just need to select where we want it to be red. Next, for X-ray patients, symbols will change the color. Let's use blue. Next, for MRI patients, let's change the color to pink. Then for EKG patients, let's change the color to black. Next, let's create the servers. We'll have 8 servers. And finally, we'll have 1 sink. Let's name the servers. First one, registration. We'll set this one to triage. The third one, X-ray. Then MRI. Let's set this one for treatment. We'll need another one for lab. We'll need another one for EKG. And finally, we'll need one for accounting. Let's assign the entity type to each source. For source 1, set it to walk-in patients. For source 2, we'll set it to lab patients. For source 3, we set the entity type to X-ray patients. For source 4, we will set the entity type to MRI patients. And finally, for source 5, we will set the entity type to EKG patients. Next, we will create the sequence tables. Select Data, Table Tools, Schema, Add Table, and Add Sequence Table. We will rename the sequence table to Walk-in Sequence. The routing table that we had at the beginning of the video is what we will use now. We will set first input at registration. Then after that, we will have to go to triage. After triage, it will be input at treatment. And finally, input at accounting. The last step, though, is we need to exit the system. So we also need to send it to input at sync 1. We'll add another sequence table. Again, click Table Tools, Schema, Add Table, and Add Sequence Table. This one, we will call it the Lab Sequence Table. And the sequence for the labs is the simplest of all of them. We'll start with input at lab, then write to accounting, and then input at sync 1. And that's it. For the next one, go to Schema, Add Table, Sequence Table. The third one that we're going to add will be for the X-ray sequence. Let's rename that. In this case, there's a registration component required. Then after that, they can go and do the X-ray, followed by accounting, and then input at sync 1. To exit the system. The fourth sequence table, this one will be MRI sequence. Similar to the previous X-ray sequence table, we'll have registration, but instead of X-rays, we'll have the MRI. Input at MRI. Then we'll have input at accounting and finally input at sync 1. Let's add the fifth and final sequence table. This one will be called EKG sequence. Just like before, it'll be similar. There is a registration step. Then it'll be input at EKG, then input at accounting, and finally input at sync 1. Now that we've created these 5 sequence tables, we need to assign the sequence tables to each entity type. We'll go back to the facility view, and if we select walk-in patients, under routing logic, we will now select the initial sequence walk-in sequence. For lab patients, we'll do the same, but instead we will select lab sequence. For X-ray patients, we will select the routing logic, initial sequence, and this time we will pick X-ray sequence. For MRI patients, set the initial sequence to MRI sequence. Then for EKG patients, we'll set the initial sequence to EKG sequence. Next, we need to update the routing logic in the output of each source and for each server. We can select one at a time and set the properties, or we can select multiple by using the control key to do multi-select. I'm selecting the output for each of the sources and each of the servers. After doing this, I will select, under the routing logic, the entity destination type. We will set this to be by sequence. The last step is to set the free space travel mode. For this, we need to do this at the entity level, so we will select all of the entities. We can do these together using multi-select with control, since we're going to set the same properties. Here we'll update the travel logic. We'll set the desired speed to 0.25. That's in meters per second. Then we want to set the initial travel mode to free space only. This allows us to run this model without having to apply the connectors and allow the different routing sequences to go through the system, depending on the entity type routing sequence that we've specified. The last part that we need to do is to set up the inter-arrival times and the service times. Let's set up the inter-arrival times for source 1, source 2, source 3, source 4, and source 5. For the walk-in patients, the inter-arrival times are exponentially distributed with mean of 6 minutes, so let's change this to 6. Make sure that the units are minutes, which they are. For source 2, we will set this to be 3 minutes. For source 3, we will set this to 12 minutes. Source 4, for MRI patients, we will set this to 10 minutes. Finally, for source 5, we will set this to be 30 minutes for EKG. The final step is to set the service distributions on each server. For registration, we had a triangular distribution with only one server. So we'll leave the initial capacity at 1 and we'll set this to random.triangular, and the parameters that we had were 1, 2, 3. Now for triage, we also have an initial capacity of 1, and then we had 3, 5, 7 minutes. For X-ray, we have one server, so we leave initial capacity at 1, and we set the processing time to be random.triangular. This one will be 8, 10, and 12. For MRI, we have 2 servers, so we need to set initial capacity to 2. For random.triangular, we have the parameters 14, 18, 22. Also in minutes. Then for treatment, we have 2 servers, so it's an initial capacity of 2. Random triangular with 7, 10.5, 14 minutes. For the lab, we have 4 servers. And we'll use random.triangular with the values 6, 10, 14 minutes. For EKG, we have only one server, and we'll set random.triangular 20, 25, 30 minutes. Finally, for accounting, we will set this to be 2, 5, 8. With 4 servers. We now have a model that we can run with the free space travel mode. Let's try and run. We see the entities of different colors going through the system. There's a bit of a queue waiting at registration, and we see multiple patients being served at the labs. We can stop this. Another thing that we can do is we can change the symbols on here. We could set, for example, instead of a triangle, we can add a symbol. In Simio, there's a large number of options. If we want to set different types of patients to different people, there are different characters that we can use. We can view in 2 dimensions, or we can also view in 3 dimensions. Then we can run this. We'll see the various, in this case, triangles going through the system. If we want to specify the different symbols to be people, we can do that as well. Now if we view this in 3D mode and we run this, we will see the people as patients that are going through the system. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed building this Simio simulation model for the healthcare clinic. We'll have more simulation models that we'll be building. In your assignment, you'll get to work on running this model several times and then also extending the model. I hope you enjoyed this exercise and I look forward to seeing you in our next class.